Here's one of my hottest takes. Not all conspiracy theorists are fascists. Yet. But sooner or later, they have to go there. And a mortally dangerous number of Americans already are. I'm editing this last video here, but I wanted to show you something that I just got that kind of freaked me out. This isn't our local newspaper. It looks like one. It's even got the name of the county in the title, but I've never seen it before because I don't think it existed before the midterm season. What this is a propaganda pamphlet. It's intentionally misrepresenting policies to say that Democrats are gonna release dangerous criminals. It just plasters mugshots of black men and groom our children with sex education and trans rights. Where did this come from? I do not know, but it can't be local. All the actual stories are just like copy-pasted right-wing blog posts, and everything that actually looks like it's local is just like recycled publicly available data. Like the back is literally just a page full of former high school athletes and like their photos and statistics, which I'm not gonna show you because I don't think they know they're in it. I didn't want this garbage. And there aren't any ads, so someone who isn't disclosed by the pamphlet is footing the bill to send this to me. It took some actual journalism from an NPR station to explain what was going on with a whole regional network of these. Which, of course, it was a Republican Political Action Committee. The People Who Play by the Rules PAC. I'm assuming that name is ironic, because it got $40 million from an election denier this year. That means insanely rich, paranoid extremist fascists are dumping their unlimited money into spreading unaccountable lies to at least hundreds of thousands of people. So, what's new? Maybe the idea of billionaire-funded propaganda would have frightened me a few years ago, but this is an old trick that's failed before. Because this is lifted straight out of the last era, in which democracy crushed the fascist movement in America for a generation. In 1939, the most popular radio personality in the United States by far, reaching tens of millions of Americans every week, was a priest. Father Charles Coughlin plagiarized Nazi propaganda for his newsletter, told his listeners that Jews deserved to be terrorized in German ghettos, and helped inspire a nationwide movement of armed Christian nationalists who began a violent campaign to overthrow the government and create a fascist state in America. All because of conspiracy theories. Welcome to part 3 of my video essay series. The story of the Coughlin-inspired insurrectionists is insane and horrifying, and it's another failure of our schools that I had no idea until we got 2 different podcasts about it this year. And if you want to know why it is that conspiracy theorists, who are supposed to be fighting against evil cabals of dictators, come to love corrupt, oppressive autocrats, here's one of my hottest takes. Not all conspiracy theorists are fascists. Yet. But sooner or later, they have to go there. And a mortally dangerous number of Americans already are. Let's say you're someone who believes that Tom Hanks eats babies. What are you going to do about that? It is your right as an American to call your representatives and demonstrate publicly demanding that Tom Hanks be tried and executed. The problem for you, in this case, is that Tom Hanks is not a child-eating demon cannibal, actually. The legal system has standards of healthy skepticism that all the prosecutors and judges and lawyers are working to maintain. There's lots of ways they fail those standards all the time, but they aren't going to be compromised anywhere near this badly, especially for your sake. So, what are you going to do about that? You could just leave it at that, and stew in the fact that Tom gets to be a beloved movie star while he secretly indulges in satanic orgies. Or, you might be able to vote on it. If a candidate promises that they will do everything in their power to make sure that Tom Hanks is put on trial for his crimes against humanity, they've probably earned your vote. But if they get elected, they're going to have the same problem that you had. They can't legitimately make the justice system go after Tom Hanks. So, there's only 2 options left then. State violence or street violence. Either the conspiracist politician has to somehow force the system to go after your political enemies, or you have to take matters into your own hands. Conspiracists tell themselves that this is politics. That's what my dad calls it all the time. He doesn't think that Tom Hanks eats babies, but he does think that all of his theories about secret communist revolutions and plots to depopulate the world and declare martial law are politics. If it is, then what are his policy positions? What does he think our tax rate should be? How should industries and unions be regulated? Should we spend more or less on infrastructure? Should weed be legal? What does he want the government to do? His conspiracy theories don't answer any of those questions, except the last one. The politics of fascism begins with defining enemies, saying that they are evil, which is the second half of what the conspiracy theorist's totalitarian certainty is all about. That's the easy part, and I kind of already did an essay about that a while ago, but fascism also says the first half, that we are innocent. This book is The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder. It's the best one I've recommended so far, and even though Snyder isn't very interested in conspiracy theories specifically, he knows more than almost anyone about fascism, or what he calls the politics of eternity. It's eternal in that it's an ideology that says nothing changes. There are no alternatives. All we can learn is what we already knew, and all we can become is what we already were, and what we were is innocent. There was a mythical past when things were the way they were supposed to be, until an evil enemy upended everything. And if we can just destroy that enemy once and for all, things will go back to that state of Edenic innocence forever. The problem is that you can't destroy that enemy, especially if it doesn't exist. But even if it does, you're never going to destroy it once and for all. But even if you do, that's not going to bring back a past that never was. Thus, fascism's essentially innocent community of us is eternally at war for its survival against an essentially evil them. It needs to always be destroying enemies, always believing that its innocence gives it the right to do so, until it eventually has to declare war on reality itself. That is what the conspiracy theorist is all about. And the deeper they go, the closer they come to outright fascism, because I would say conspiracism is fascism. Not that it's like fascism or that it's a part of fascism, but that conspiracism is fascism. Case in point, the Nazis were the worst conspiracy theorists in history. Their entire worldview that justified everything they did was the belief that, for thousands of years, the Jews had been undermining the natural hierarchy of races so that they could secretly rule the world from the shadows. To the Nazis, any belief that taught equality and compassion among humanity was a part of the secret plan.
What Hitler argues in his book Mein Kampf is that the Jews are responsible for all ideas which allow humans to regard one another as humans. For Hitler, any way of seeing ourselves in non-racial terms is Jewish and anti-human and anti-natural.
Christianity, Buddhism, democracy, communism, all of it was supposed to be some Jewish scheme to conquer the master race by bringing them down to everyone else's level. They told themselves, and still tell themselves, that no one actually believes in equality or harmony or anything like that, and anyone who says that they do is lying on behalf of the eternal Jewish plot for world domination. That lets them believe that their movement is actually supposed to free the world of Jewish control by restoring the rightful hierarchy of races, with them on top and all of their enemies destroyed. So when conspiracy theorists start talking about cultural Marxism or Judeo-Bolshevism, or when they accuse the more liberal billionaires of being communists, this is where that comes from. They're motivated to believe that any basically decent person is a liar, and they're really the good ones because they understand that the world is meant to be dominated by a brutal racial hierarchy. Timothy Snyder is great. He's been one of my biggest influences for the past few years, but I think his points here come across best when you mix him with this guy. If you couldn't tell, he's the president of Czechoslovakia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and is probably one of the most important democratic leaders that we English speakers don't really learn about. This is Václav Havel, and I'm not totally sure he's trying to say this, but when I read his essays alongside Snyder, I pick up something that I find personally essential as an explanation for the fascist politics of conspiracists. Fascism is a class of totalitarian ideology. It tries to consume every aspect of our lives with uncompromising beliefs that resist reality. But I think that Havel might be also saying that totalitarianism draws us to it by absolving us of the need to make moral demands of ourselves. It makes us innocent, accepted by our group as right and good for what we believe, in spite of anything we've done or might do. It offers that we give up our morality in exchange for totalitarian certainty, the absolute belief in what makes us eternally innocent. Fascism says that as long as you keep destroying the enemies that you hate, you are blameless, no matter what you do. The only demand that matters to fascism is conveniently what the fascists wanted to do all along. But this also includes the Soviet Union's communism. It said that the state would inevitably lead the workers of the world through each phase of history until they reached the perfect society. All the people needed to do was what the party leaders said, regardless of what it was, and they would be absolved. And it's the free market capitalist ideology of movement conservatism. It's been telling us for decades that greed is good. All anyone has to do is make as much money as they want and everything will turn out great. The wealth will trickle down, absolving you of whatever you did or might do to get rich. I think Havel and T.S. Eliot would agree that those are all totalitarian ideologies, because they're utopian. They believe they can create the perfect world where people don't need to be good anymore. All of these are expressions of Snyder's Politics of Inevitability and Politics of Eternity, the two edges of the sword that destroys anything else that might make moral demands that cause us shame. Fascism destroys alternatives by promising an eternal utopia, while communism and capitalism destroy alternatives by promising an inevitable utopia. But here, in a post-2020 world, we can see how the politics of inevitability become the politics of eternity when the inevitable fails to happen. In the end, they have no choice but to demand that all of eternity be filled with the will to power of their essential innocence so that they need not fear shame nor weakness before their enemies ever again. That's what they want the government to do. If that sounded terrifying to you, good. This is why we're seeing the beginnings of another violent insurgency of far-right extremists who want to end democracy. And it's why, if we're going to make it through this, we need to relearn what it means to take deadly seriously the politics of fascism and of democracy. Back in 1940, when the Christian Front and other groups like them were terrorizing America, getting law enforcement to act was kind of a lift, but sometimes they did. The FBI charged a group of mostly Christian Front members with stockpiling weapons and plotting to overthrow the government. They were all from Brooklyn, and when these Brooklyn boys went to trial, they had the public at their back. Despite being obviously guilty, the jury let most of them off, and the rest got off with a mistrial. And the New York journalists described them as being zealous, but harmless. They were just some boys who had learned their lesson. We didn't need to do anything else about it because they, the fascists, were part of us. This is why, even after we all saw a violent insurrection attempt to overthrow democracy live on TV, it feels like we have to beg people to take the threat seriously. It's just a fact that a critical mass of Americans right now will see a crowd of white people using patriotic Christian symbols as a group of boys. Essentially innocent boys who are understandably acting out against a system that most of us don't trust anyway. In any case, they've learned their lesson, so everything must be fine now. There's a now infamous New York Times Siena College poll saying that 71% of American voters believe democracy is at risk, but only 7% think that's the most important issue in this year's midterms. There was quite a bit of shock and despair over this in the liberal world, which I totally get, but the results are about what I would expect. We talk about all this like the fascist movement has some kind of secret evil genius superpower to sway the masses, but it doesn't. It's just the same shtick it's always been. What makes it seem so daunting to us is that our own American totalitarian ideology of capitalism has told us that political fates are inevitable. We can't do anything about it. Tax cuts and a global market tragically failed in their prophesied quest to create a democratic free world, so now we have to plunge into darkness. Sorry. Greed failed to absolve us, so now wrath will. But nothing is inevitable, and everything is a matter of what all of us do. There was a violent movement in the 1930s and in 1940 to turn this country into a fascist state, both among the people and within Congress. It got about as bad as things are now, if not worse, and it failed. It failed in part because the politics of inevitability and of eternity are just lazy politics. The point is to give people the easy way out, the one that doesn't demand anything of them, but also doesn't work. This gives it the illusion of evil genius, because the politics of democracy can't do that. We can't beat the fascists at that game, because we know that the only way to do this is the hard way, not the impossible way by any means, but just the only way that anything good and lasting has ever been made. If the politics of fascism begins with defining enemies and ends with waging war on reality, the politics of democracy begins with defining problems, and it continues with making moral demands of ourselves. It doesn't mean judging people. That's useless. It's just taking responsibility for those problems and persuading others to as well. And the politics of democracy only ends when it gives up and decides to find an enemy instead. But here's where democracy has a huge leg up. Problems exist, and fascism is wrong about everything. Enemies can't be destroyed, but problems can be solved. You are, right now, surrounded by 1 billion solved problems that were literally unimaginably impossible to the vast majority of humans who have ever lived. And the only way any of them were solved was with persuasion and trust. We solved them by demanding something of ourselves, convincing others to do the same, and then helping each other do it by being good. And what is even the point of society, if not that? I'm going to give us on the left a little tough love here when I say that we've had a lot of issues with trying to destroy enemies instead of solving problems too. It's totally understandable. I am absolutely guilty of that, but it's why we always feel like we're losing even when we win. It's so easy to play the fascist game, but it's their game. It's impossible to beat them at it. So don't play their game. They're in our house. Make them play our game. What are they going to do about inflation? What are they going to do about opioid addiction? What are they going to do about unaffordable healthcare, childcare, housing, and education? What are they going to do about immigration policy? What are they going to do about rising crime? What are they going to do about police accountability? What are they going to do about women's health and lives being threatened by abortion bans? What are they going to do about gun violence? What are they going to do about layoffs during a pandemic rebound recession? What do they want the government to do? But we already know the answer to that. This is actually one of my most effective maybe that's true but answers that I give my dad. Like, maybe that's true, but how is putting this person in jail going to solve this problem? And this is why Michigan Senator McMorrow blew up in the way she did. Like, she did this. She called out the destruction of enemies as petty, ineffectual toxicity that didn't solve anything. Don't look for enemies to destroy. Don't indulge in that cynical grievance. The fascists will always beat you to it, and even if they don't, they'll just use your win to rally even more people against you, because trying to destroy enemies is the same thing as arguing with a conspiracy theorist about their beliefs. It's fundamentally impossible and will only make things worse. So, you should do the same thing to both. Dismiss it as pointless. Instead, make the conversation about what it should be about anyway. Make it about the problems that the fascists can't fix. And take them seriously, all of them. Be creative and practical and assertive with ideas about how to solve them. I believe in gun control solutions. If some paranoid extremist wants to accuse me of trying to take everyone's guns away, that's not true, but it doesn't matter. They're ignoring the fact that there's a huge problem with gun violence everyone cares about by turning people like me into an enemy that needs to be destroyed. So let's take control of the conversation by being creative. How about something like sports cars? Let's say you're a super rich person with some crazy souped up Ferrari that goes 300 miles per hour. It's literally a race car, not even street legal. So you don't keep it at home, you keep it at a garage at the racetrack. Then when you want to take it for a drive, you go to the racetrack, rev it up, have some fun, then go home. Why don't we treat guns like we do cars? At home, you've got your pump shotguns, your bolt-action rifles, your revolvers, like your classic manual tube-fed weapons that are all you need for hunting and pest control and home defense. Those are your Ford Explorers and F-150s. Then there's your AR-15s, your AK-47s, your goddamn M60s. Those are your Lamborghinis and your Ferraris. What are you going to do with those at home that you can't do with the SUV? There's no point in having those on the street where something might happen to them, so you keep those at the racetrack, where you get to have the most fun with them. What if we had a law that lifted all restrictions for new purchases of assault weapons for anyone over 18? And we'll define assault weapons as any automatic or semi-automatic firearm that's fed by a detachable magazine. And what if we made it so that all newly purchased assault weapons are always stored on premises at gun ranges? Your fully automatic heavy machine gun is kept on a rack in a vault with your name on it, where staff handles everything for you. Maintenance, transportation, brokering new purchases. They're your people in your community who you trust taking care of your guns. Then when you want to go shooting, you go to the gun range, they give you your gun, you do some target practice with the boys, then they put your Ferrari back in the garage when you're done, and you drive home in the Ford Explorer. If you already have assault weapons, no problem. You can keep those at home and even take them to the range yourself, but the government could cut you a nice check up front, something like a gun buyback, if you choose to store it at the gun range. And if you have an assault weapon illegally, then there's no questions asked. Just store it at the gun range and get it off the street. You'll get the money and no one will investigate. I mean, unless you committed a crime with the gun. That would take funding, for sure, but nowhere near anything impossible. We would also need to help all the gun ranges that can manage it offer storage for people's assault weapons, which would be a challenge, but probably doable with like $3 or $4 billion, and that's basically nothing. It wouldn't solve everything, because nothing can. That's not how it works. But I think something like that could fix a lot of the problem while preserving and even expanding responsible gun owners' rights and culture, and letting gun manufacturers keep selling all the assault weapons they want. Is that maybe a compromise we can talk about? Because maybe it's stupid and would never work. If it is, then tell me why, and we can figure out what might work instead. There's a problem here that we all agree is a problem, so there has to be a way we can work together to solve it.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that exciting? It can seem like most problems are just frustrating and tedious, but I guarantee you that every problem and its solutions are extremely interesting to someone who has to deal with them in their real life. And as soon as you offer them a new creative solution, the politics of fascism will vanish from their mind like it was never there. At least for that conversation. I know this can work, for a fact, because I've reported on local politics in rural America. I know there's a perception nowadays that it's just crazy people shouting at school board meetings, but much more often it's the most low-key, inspiring example of people who have no choice but to solve problems, so they have no choice but the politics of democracy. Not too long ago, there was a question of solar panel policy that came up to a county board when a far-right group pressured them to effectively ban all new solar panel projects. They blasted everything you'd expect to this 100% MAGA Republican county board. But then the board heard counter-arguments from environmental groups and solar industry people explaining that if solar panel construction could continue with reasonable restrictions, it could bring more high-paying maintenance jobs to the area and lower people's electricity bills. Yes, they had statistics and logical arguments, but by far more important was that they understood the board members' experiences and perspectives. They justified themselves as being worthy of acceptance at that meeting because they showed they cared about the county's real problems. Afterwards, I went up to the oldest and whitest of the old white board members to find out what he thought. And he, along with most of the others there, thought that the pro-solar side made sense. He'd be fine with a few restrictions to keep things safe and pretty, but there was no sense in stifling economic growth that might also help phase out an ugly coal power plant. It was almost indistinguishable from talking to a Democrat about renewable energy. If you think the fascists have some kind of secret superpower that we can't understand, this is our superpower that the fascists can't understand. Just remember that problems are real, even the ones we might want to ignore or disagree about. Don't be afraid of them or dismiss them, because if we're debating about how to fix problems, we're winning. No matter what, they're our strength, because the fascists can't beat us at it. They can't be a part of that conversation. They can't even make the trains run on time. So make them play our game. To be absolutely clear, I am not saying that people who are violent, seditious, or corrupt criminals shouldn't be held accountable, or that we shouldn't viciously criticize influential fascists who manipulate people with big lies. Both of those things need to happen for the sake of justice and persuading people towards truth. But putting Trump on trial is like fact-checking him. It's absolutely necessary, but it's triage. If you're fact-checking the lie, you have already lost that round, and all the system can do is damage control. It's all it can ever do, because democratic systems have only ever been communities of persuasion and trust, without which fact-checking or debunking is worse than useless. Convicting Trump or pushing Tucker off the air, as much as they deserve it, won't do anything to save America. Not by itself. We need to say the truth first, which means believing we can solve problems, because of course we can. It's objectively, ridiculously wrong to say we can't. It just requires the very, very hard, but not impossible work of persuasion and trust. So how did the anti-fascists beat the fascist movement of the 1930s and 1940s? They did this. They published their own local newspapers, they organized groups to demonstrate and volunteer and vote, and some of them took down rings of fascist insurgents by infiltrating them and reporting them to the feds. Which is pretty badass, though I can't recommend that for your safety. Guys, for real, we've beat them before, we can do it again. To that end, I am currently trying to figure out how to safely create in-person support groups for people who have lost relationships to paranoid extremism. As far as I can tell, it's something that doesn't really exist, but it really should, because we need every kind of organization and support in physical space that we can make to persuade and build trust. How am I going to do it? I'm not totally sure yet. Probably starting small, and definitely not alone, because that's how everything works in the grassroots. If you think that you can do something like that too, you need to demand it of yourself. You need to persuade others to demand it of themselves too, and you need to help each other do it. It doesn't mean you need to devote your life to it. You have a ton of other extremely important things to care about. But if everyone just does a little bit to fix problems, we can expose fascism as the lazy, vile, cynical grift that it is, and we can save democracy.